Okay, let's begin. Hello, Zoom people. Welcome everyone to our 9th public lecture on yet another very, very wet, miserable Thursday evening. I want to acknowledge what British Columbians know only too well, which is that we are only now just assessing the scale of the damage of record-breaking torrential rains over the last several days. Our hearts go out to anyone out there who is listening or viewing this lecture as they manage the consequences of that deluge. These public lectures give us a chance to showcase the research of local and visiting researchers at the center, whether they are philosophers, sociologists, literary critics, theologians, anthropologists, or religious studies scholars. Our speakers each provide a window into the ways religious communities and phenomena might be critically engaged. This evening's speaker is Dr. McDonough, a longtime friend of the CSRS and a longtime friend of mine. Graham has played many roles at the center. He's been and still is an associate fellow. He has chaired our advisory council and been on our program committee, and he is currently a faculty fellow. Graham is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the Faculty of Education here at UVic. A philosopher by orientation, he helps his undergraduate and graduate students enter the teaching and sometimes research careers with a sophisticated grasp of the intellectual issues at stake in the classroom. He has a special interest in the ways religious, in particular Catholic schools, respond to the challenges of religious and cultural diversity, as well as changing norms around sexuality. Over the years, I've learned a great deal from him about the ways the intellectual issues we tease out at the CSRS actually land, as it were, in the classrooms and in the staff rooms of our schools. Now, many of you will know that one of the themes that often surfaces at the CSRS is the question of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada. Graham looks unflinchingly at the way certain key ideas that are integral to the many forms of Christianity that we think about continue to make any thorough ongoing reconciliation quite difficult. My own sense is that Graham's sober analysis is an important part of acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And so given how important reconciliation is to us in this room and in this community at the CSRS, I will now direct your attention to our friend Graham. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And it's good to see you here and everyone on Zoom. So I have approached my work on controversial issues in Catholic schools from the perspective of a critical insider, highlighting a range of thought within the Catholic experience in order to critique the norms of Catholic institutions. For example, my book entitled Beyond Obedience and Abandonment, Toward a Theory of Dissent in Catholic Education, not only considers how one might disagree and remain a faithful Catholic, but how Catholic schools might employ this possibility in the service of students and their parents when disagreements arise about religion curriculum or school rules. One event that prompted me to write that book was the Mark Hall case in 2002. Mr. Hall was a student in a Catholic high school in Oshawa, Ontario, and that school denied his request to bring his boyfriend as his prom date. But in the aftermath, the Ontario Catholic bishops issued a document entitled Pastoral Guidelines to Assist Students of Same-Sex Orientation. And that would later inform their rationale for resisting students' requests to establish gay-straight alliances in Catholic schools. Part of their argument appeals to the concept of scandal. In Catholic theology, scandal refers to establishing or permitting conditions that would cause another person to sin. In this case, referring to what the bishops define as sinful. In 2017, I published an argument that not only did the bishops make a problematic appeal to scandal, but that there are many theoretical concerns with the concept itself. And one of those concerns led me to the subject of this talk. One of the kinds of scandal in Catholic theology is called Pharisaical scandal. This conception does not represent a disinterested historical account of the Pharisees, who were an ancient Jewish sect, but rather the Pharisees as the Christian Gospels portray them. This portrayal is therefore the basis for influential Catholic thinkers to describe that type of scandal as, and I'm quoting here from the New Catholic Encyclopedia, the morose reaction of those who, like the Pharisees in the time of Christ, wrest the words and action of a good man to their own hurt by perverse misconstruction. The appearance of this concept in the context of my arguing about GSAs in Catholic schools raised my awareness to a fact that Christian scriptures consistently portray Jews and Judaism negatively, and that these scriptures are at the center of both liturgical life and religious education. Christian grace is regularly portrayed against a foil of Jewish legalism, which involves the scribes and Pharisees trying to trick Jesus. And the word Pharisee even persists in the English language today as a synonym for hypocrite. It's there in the Oxford English Dictionary. What was going on here and how deep did this go? And it was at this point I decided to turn my attention toward the concept of supersessionism. The parts of the word supersessionism reveal its meaning from the Latin, where supersedere means to sit on top of. Within Christian theology, it refers to a belief that Christianity has evolved from and replaced Judaism. It has been a source of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism for centuries. Therefore, the most positive assessment of Judaism that normative Catholic teaching could offer is that Judaism is praiseworthy as a kind of proto-Christianity, but not as holy or salvific as Christianity itself. It makes this assessment in Christian-centered terms and does not see Judaism in its own terms. I also noticed that the supersessionist mindset informs the Christian triumphalism that is present in European colonialism. Colonizers did not regard the non-European persons they encountered on their own terms, but in comparative Eurocentric terms, and even as representatives of humanity in its, and I'm quote unquote, pre-civilized condition. The anthropologist Paige West describes how European colonizers, armed with a comparative evolutionary Eurocentric view, perceived non-Europeans as either progressing toward the civilization Europeans had established, or else as stuck on the path toward it. In other words, rather than appreciating cultures as being different in kind, it evaluated them by degrees. The supersessionist root of Christianity is therefore congruent with the Catholic Church's later assessments of all other non-Christian religions, spiritualities, and lifeways. In 2020, I published an article in Religious Education that compares the appearances of supersessionism in two places where Catholic schools receive public funding: Brisbane, Australia, and the Canadian province of Ontario. That study prompted me to think further about this congruence between supersessionism and colonial structures in Catholic thought, and how it might have implications here in Canada for Catholic school responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. It prompted me to hypothesize that supersessionism obstructs Catholic Church efforts at reconciliation with Indigenous persons and groups. My consideration of this hypothesis begins with a broad but robust generalization that reconciliation should entail apologies for both past actions and the modes of thought that enabled them. This means that Catholic Church apologies for the actions of residential schooling must also acknowledge and apologize for Catholic Church disrespect of the religious freedom of Indigenous persons and disrespect of Indigenous spiritualities, beliefs, practices, and lifeways. I will show how one of the Canadian Catholic bishops' major efforts at reconciliation has recognized the violations of Indigenous persons' religious freedom, but has not sufficiently recognized the ways of thinking that enabled colonizers to believe that indigenous spiritualities were less than Catholic Christianity. I will show how the insufficiencies in that effort echo a wider insufficiency in current church teaching, and that this feature enables colonial structures of thought to persist in a new guise. To supersede something means to replace or outrank it. Within Christian thought, there are two kinds of supersessionism known as hard and soft. This distinction relies on the degree to which they make claims about replacement. Hard supersessionism includes views like those held by the early church fathers that the Jews were being punished for their alleged disobedience of God and non-belief in Jesus as the Christ. Another hard supersessionist variety is the claim that Israel's role as the people of God somehow expires with the arrival of Jesus, and that the Christian church takes its place as the new people of God. So soft supersessionism, by contrast, claims that while Judaism and the covenants with Noah, Abraham, and Moses remained valid, they are nonetheless incomplete unless they point toward the new covenant that Jesus brings. According to this view, Judaism lags behind Christianity and is even regarded as being stuck there. However, this concept does not have to be either Christian-centered or necessarily rely on comparisons between traditions. So one of the most important considerations to make is to avoid an assumption that today's Judaism is the same as that of the first century. David Novak offers a helpful observation here that beliefs and practices do change, and hence a tradition's current ways might have superseded its past ones. In my reading, he regards those changes outside an us-them framework, and instead contrasts ourselves of points in the past against ourselves of the present. So this framing allows that supersessionism might be a normal feature within religious traditions because it relativizes and contextualizes the internal changes traditions experience over time, as opposed to grading the differences between two or more different traditions. So it's in this sense that he writes, both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism come out of and thereby supersede a religion based on the Hebrew Bible, plus some developments coming from the elaborative interpretations of Second Temple Jewish theology, the time after the final books of the Hebrew Bible were written, but before the first century of Christianity. This religion could be called Hebraic monotheism. It is neither Judaism nor Christianity, at least as we know them from the second century on. Judaism and Christianity have been continually superseding this ancient religion. Both have done so without forgetting their ever-present, ever-necessary foundation in Hebraic monotheism. So how does normative Catholicism understand non-Christian religions? It is important to notice here that I am examining normative Catholic teaching as expressed through documents issued by the Pope, cardinals, and bishops, and reflected in the Catholic school curricula that they authorize. These sources are a very important and powerful aspect of the Catholic Church in Canada and what Canadian Catholic schools teach. At the same time, they do not necessarily represent exactly what all Catholics believe or practice, or how teachers in Catholic schools negotiate between those teachings, their own professional knowledge, the beliefs of the students they serve, and the hopes of those students' parents. My book that I presented earlier in this talk is an example of that kind of work. Here, I am presenting a critique of Catholic teaching as it relates the authorized institutional norms within which Catholic schools operate. How did the Catholic Church understand non-Christian religions for the majority of its existence? The late Catholic theologian Gregory Baum states it plainly. writing that for many centuries, the Catholic Church believed that people who were not Catholics went to hell after they died. This was the belief structure that was in place during most of the years when the Catholic Church was involved with residential schooling. This view changed in 1965 when the Second Vatican Council, a gathering of the world's Catholic bishops, cardinals, and pope between 1962 and 1965, issued its Declaration on the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions, often known by its Latin title, Nostra Aetate. And just for reference, the Catholic Church still follows a practice of adopting a document's first 2 or sometimes 3 Latin words as its title. And so in English translation, that declaration begins with the phrase, "in our day." This document reflects the Church's response to the horrors of World War II and especially the Shoah, with the recognition that centuries of anti-Jewish rhetoric had contributed to modern anti-Semitism. Its opening sections, for example, establish a theme of human commonality on generic spiritual questions, and it develops this theme into explicit recognitions of the holiness it finds not only in Judaism, but also in Buddhism, Hindu religions, and Islam. As important as this recognition was at the time of its writing, Nostra Aetate still has problems. For example, the Council did not raise the concept of generic spiritual commonality to propose an equality of religions. Rather, it uses spiritual commonality as the groundwork to exchange that binary preconciliar view of going to hell for what John Tatamanel terms a graded inclusivism, where each non-Christian religion is now understood to have holy elements that only approximate the purported perfection of holiness and salvation in Catholic Christianity. That structure of gradation is not really the content of Nostra Aetate's teaching, but also its rhetorical design. Its second section reveals this structure's presence, even before Nostra Aetate names any particular non-Christian religions. The document writes, "From ancient times down to the present, there is found among various peoples a certain perception of that hidden power which hovers over the course of things and over the events of human history. At times, some indeed have come to the recognition of a supreme being or even of a father. This perception and recognition penetrates their lives with a profound religious sense." Even though this passage offers a much more positive outlook than going to hell, the subtleties of its phrasing establish graded evolutionary comparisons as it describes humans moving away from one way of believing to another. That intuitively vague perception of a certain unnamed hidden power gives way to the more rationally definitive recognition of a supreme being, with capital letters announcing its greater subjectivity. The logic also implies a graduated narrowing, where not all hidden powers are necessarily supreme beings, and not all supreme beings may even be called Father, like the one who appears in the Christian Lord's Prayer. The logical sequencing of these concepts suggests that common human spirituality evolves toward a progressively refined Christian end. These themes of refinement, development, and gradation continue as the Council moves on to discuss how religions that in its view are bound up with an advanced culture continue to grapple with spiritual questions, just with more refined concepts and a more developed language. And here, its use of the term advanced culture depends on an unstated acceptance that comparatively less advanced cultures also exist. Nostra Aetate is echoing views that are congruent with the rationales colonizers used to justify their attempts to convert and civilize the indigenous persons they encountered, reveals that such comparative thought persisted not only in 1965 when the document was written, but that it remains for Catholics to contend with today. I recall how John Tatamanel points out that Nostra Aetate's positive assessments of Hindu religions and Buddhism only go so far as to acknowledge what the Catholic Church finds as rays of truth within those traditions, a metaphor that suggests that while these religions reflect a partial enlightenment, a fully revealed light sits elsewhere. The Council Fathers write that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere reverence those ways of conduct and of life, those precepts and teachings, which, though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and set forth, nonetheless often reflect a ray of truth which enlightens all people. The Council's view of Islam reinforces this view. It lists several theological commonalities between the Church and Islam, but also notes that while Muslims do not acknowledge Jesus as God, they revere him as a prophet. Nostra Aetate thus allows that Islam also has rays of truth that nonetheless remain only approximations of its full expression in Catholic Christianity. With regard to Judaism, Nostra Aetate shows how Catholic teaching has moved away from the hard forms of supersessionism, but has retained its softer form, where Judaism only reaches its fulfillment in Christianity. It writes that the Church of Christ acknowledges that, according to God's saving design, the beginnings of her faith and her election are found already among the patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. This acknowledgement, therefore, declares what the Church claims to supersede. At the same time, Nostra Aetate states that God holds the Jews most dear, and that the covenants with Noah, Abraham, and Moses remain valid because he does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. The supersessionist framing remains strong, however. Consider that this seemingly benign phrase, announcing that the Church awaits the day known to God alone, on which all peoples will address the Lord in a single voice and serve him shoulder to shoulder, can be read as an expression of the Council's confident belief that Jews will eventually catch up to Christians, not standing behind or ahead, but beside them, shoulder to shoulder, as equals. In other words, the Council believes that Judaism is a perfectly good religion that will eventually evolve and be absorbed into the Christianity that supersedes it. It is also important here to present Nostra Aetate's statements that most strongly reflect its being written in a post-World War II context. Even at these points, it only makes its clear rejection of hard supersessionism, that the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures, and its condemnation of hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. It only makes these statements after first proclaiming that the Church is the new people of God. Nostra Aetate is written in a way that enables the Church to announce its respect for other religions, but only by replacing any negative evaluation of them with a positive assessment of how they are on the road to the fullest holiness that Catholicism claims. These are the features of normative Catholicism's soft supersessionism. One other Vatican II document is relevant here because it is the chief reference point that the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops uses in its response to the TRC's call to action number 48, which is to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That Vatican II document is the 1965 Declaration on Religious Freedom, also known by its Latin name Dignitatis Humane, since its first words in English translation are a sense of the dignity of the human person. Where Nostra Aetate's main theme is that respect for non-Christian religions proceeds along a scale of graded inclusivism, the major emphasis in Dignitatis Humane is that religious freedom, and especially non-coercion in matters of religious belief, is at the core of human dignity. The document states that this Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all people are to be immune from coercion. The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. So another passage several sections away reinforces this view, stating that it is one of the major tenets of Catholic doctrine that humanity's response to God in faith must be free. No one, therefore, is to be forced to embrace the Christian faith against their own will. How does promoting religious freedom in this way square with the graded inclusivism that Nostra Aetate presents? In short, it does so by allowing that persons ought to be free to believe what they believe along that graded scale. But the end or apex of the graded scale remains in Catholic Christianity. To this point, Dignitatis Humane clearly announces not only its commitment to this structure, but also the Church's obligation to announce it worldwide. The document states that we believe that this one true religion subsists in the Catholic and Apostolic Church, to which the Lord Jesus committed the duty of spreading it abroad among all people. In other words, Dignitatis Humane instructs Catholics to respect the freedom to believe in a non-Christian religion and the dignity of those who do. At the same time, it also claims that those free and dignified non-Christians only believe in an approximation of the full truth that the Council claims is present in Catholic Christianity, and that it is important that the Church now shares this news with them, that is, to evangelize. This document is important because it informs the way that the Canadian Catholic bishops respond to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Persons. Call to action number 48 in the 2015 report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls upon the church parties to the settlement agreement to formally adopt and comply with the principles, norms, and standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops received this call and in 2016 issued a Catholic response to Call to Action 48 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This document presents a church response to the TRC that is framed in terms of the right to religious freedom, the norms that Dignitatis Humanae establishes. I notice how clearly and freely the bishops refer to Indigenous persons' religious freedom, including at passages like the right of Indigenous persons to practice and manifest their spiritual traditions and customs, and that the glaring failures to respect the identity and freedom of Indigenous children are particularly saddening and must never be repeated. I even found a statement in that document that so strongly echoes Dignitatis Humanae, I had to double check the source when preparing this talk, just to confirm that the Canadian bishops had authored it in 2016 and not the Second Vatican Council in 1965. It reads, by rejecting all forms of religious coercion and acknowledging the suffering caused by it, the Catholic Church not only seeks to uphold a basic human right, but to carry out its mission, which is not to force anyone to convert, but to propose to all peoples the beauty of knowing Jesus Christ. This document leaves no doubt that the Canadian bishops strongly affirm the spiritual and religious freedom of Indigenous persons, and that they can easily and clearly express this respect on the basis of normative Catholic teaching. The reliance on Catholic teaching, however, proves to be a stumbling block during the discussion of how colonizers negatively evaluated Indigenous spiritualities, which was part of the colonial project and its expression in residential schooling. The bishops only make this acknowledgement in terms of a generic expression of respect that does not address the underlying issue of Nostra Aetate's graded inclusivism. In their response's second section, entitled Respecting Indigenous Spiritual Practices, the bishops refer to and emphasize the rights of individuals not to be coerced, but say relatively little about the church's evaluation of Indigenous beliefs and practices at the time that enabled that coercion. A small exception is their quoting a short passage from the TRC report about how Christians who disparaged Indigenous students in residential schooling as pagans contradicted their own beliefs as Christians. The bishops do acknowledge that the lack of respect for Indigenous persons' identity and freedom must never be repeated, although the remainder of that document nearly exclusively focuses on freedom rather than identity. While the Church's respect for the rights of Indigenous persons to practice their spirituality is one thing, its respect for the content of that spirituality itself is another. And here I find that talk of respect for religious rights is made to do the work of respect for the content of the spiritual practices themselves. There is only a single clear, unambiguous mention of respect for Indigenous spirituality itself, which is made in the present tense grammatically. In the case of those who hold to Indigenous spirituality apart from Christianity, the Catholic Church approaches them as we would the followers of any other religion, with humility, respect, and the invitation to a sincere dialogue. That passage contains the document's only reference to Nostra Aetate, but there is no further exploration of the comparative basis which qualifies that respect along a scale of graded inclusivism. This amounts to the document apologizing for the coercion within residential schooling while eliding or skipping over its basis in the belief that Catholic Christianity was superior to Indigenous spiritualities. Framing reconciliation in terms that do not regard Indigenous spiritualities in their own terms obstructs this document's strength as part of the reconciliation process. So how does supersessionism appear in Catholic school curricula? This table shows at the bottom of the second column that more than 880,000 students are enrolled in publicly funded Catholic schools in Canada. In the following examples from two of those jurisdictions, Ontario and Saskatchewan, I will show that supersessionism and the graded inclusivism that it presumes are ongoing features of what Catholic schools present students, with the implication that its ongoing presence also impedes teaching for reconciliation. The perspectives on Jews and Judaism exist within the religious education curricula, even when the specific topic is some other feature of Catholicism, much like how I encountered the Pharisees when studying the concept of scandal. This is because so much of Christianity's self-understanding is based on its relationship with Judaism as its forebear. In this way, even at grade 1 for 6-year-olds, the Ontario curriculum's believing strand only presents the covenants with Noah, Abraham, and Moses within a narrative that leads to their completion in Jesus. Part of the big ideas within this strand read that God reveals himself to humankind in creation, our first parents, in the promise of salvation, and in his covenants with Noah, Abraham, and Moses. The fullness of God's self-revelation is manifested in the incarnation of God's word, the person of Jesus, who is truly God and truly human. A similarly worded expectation appears in grade 12, which produces the effect of supersessionism bookending the curriculum. One other example in Ontario frames Jesus' teachings not only as an evolutionary replacement of the old Jewish law, but its perfection, no less, a claim which sadly recalls that overworn trope of Jewish legalism as the foil against which Christian grace appears. It reads that grade 5 students who are 10 and 11 years old will demonstrate an understanding of how the new law, that is, law of the gospel, Jesus Christ, work of the Holy Spirit, expressed in the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount and the New Commandment, leads to the perfection of the 10 Commandments. A parallel version of this 5th grade objective appears in the 10th grade in Saskatchewan, which asks students to contrast the Mosaic law perspective on morality and sin with a contemporary Christian perspective of relationship building with God, and then to discuss the place of the 10 Commandments within Mosaic law, discuss the shift in understanding the 10 Commandments as laws, that is, enforced by the scribes and Pharisees, to a relationship with God in the spirit of the law, that is, Jesus as the fulfillment of the law. Notice that this section does not ask about contemporary Jewish perspectives on the Mosaic law or the diversity of thought in 1st century Judaism. It only asks students to compare an old, narrow, and very notably Christian-centered portrait of Judaism with a new portrait of Christianity, framing that relationship as being between an old, externally imposed and enforced Jewish law, externally imposed legalistically by the Pharisees, no less, and the new, internally spiritualized Christian freedom. These expressions of Christian self-understanding appear to have little room for students to learn about Judaism in its own terms. The teachings on non-Christian religions in both provinces are based on wider aims to evangelize or proclaim the gospel's messages to all persons. The Ontario curriculum is noteworthy here because it teaches grade 4 students, that is 8 and 9-year-olds, a belief that God wants all people to receive the gift of salvation, to which it specifically offers Jesus Christ and the gospel as examples, before stating that in order to do this, we are to respectfully, there's that word respect again, we are to respectfully invite other religions to know Jesus. Furthermore, it instructs that Christians can help people of other faiths come to know Jesus by openly sharing what we believe through small acts of charity, through acceptance and friendship, and notably what I have left on the slide for you to read, by praying for their conversion to Christ. The conception of respect here presumably aligns with the norms I related earlier, to offer or persuade without coercion, on the belief that Catholic Christianity contains the full light of holiness. In fact, the Ontario grade 11 curriculums asking students to define the Catholic Church's position on interfaith and ecumenical dialogue specifically refers to Nostra Aetate, which reveals that document's presence in the curriculum writer's mind as they wrote the whole curriculum. No less, it also refers to Pope John Paul II's 1990 encyclical letter Redemptoris Missio, which laments the presence among some Christians of a religious relativism which leads to the belief that one religion is as good as another. And this got picked up 10 years later in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's document Dominus Jesus. And at the time, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger was the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And as we are aware, Joseph Ratzinger eventually became Pope Benedict XVI. Saskatchewan's approach to evangelization is relatively less focused on teaching doctrine and more on promoting actions. The curriculum's glossary entry for that term states that evangelization is not simply to teach a doctrine, but to proclaim Jesus Christ by one's words and actions in fashion aligned with the spirit of the Gospels, respecting the dignity and freedom of others. While the phrase dignity and freedom echoes the norms in Dignitatis Humane, philosophers of education Terence McLaughlin and Sean Whittle have characterized appeals to phrases like gospel values, or as it shows up here in the phrase spirit of the Gospels, they characterize those phrases as Catholic edubabble when they appear as last words in a conversation rather than the first word of a larger discussion on what those terms and concepts mean. So without discussion of how the church conceives of dignity and freedom, the evangelization actions that the Saskatchewan curriculum promotes will probably elide or skip over details that are important indicators of how the worldwide institution of Catholicism views non-Christian religions. Social action, therefore, indicates at least the possibility of an evangelization intent, although the following action outcome does point to Saskatchewan's Catholic schools explicitly taking on current social issues within the church and province that are central to reconciliation work. There's a dialogue outcome that appears in each grade in the high school curricula asking, how can elders, teachers, and students develop and promote understandings and work together for social action surrounding issues such as residential school experiences, clergy abuse, disproportionate incarceration rates of First Nations and Métis people, and missing and murdered women and men. How does supersessionism obstruct reconciliation? Apologies for past actions are stronger when accompanied by apologies for the past structures of thought that enabled them. Efforts like the Catholic bishop's response to call to action number 48 go part of that way because they acknowledge that residential schooling did not respect the dignity and rights of Indigenous persons and groups. However, their offering respect for Indigenous spiritualities does not talk about what they mean by that respect. It is difficult to see a conception of respect that is couched in graded inclusivism as anything other than condescending and paternalistic. These features, with their roots in supersessionism and triumphalism, present an obstruction to reconciliation. The school curriculum reflects and reinforces this structure of thought. Without taking a deep look into Nostra Aetate and how the Canadian bishops conceive of respect, curricula will continue to enable a way of thinking that tends to conceive of reconciliation as just saying sorry or just apologizing for the disrespect of your rights to believe what you like, even if it's not quite as good as the full truths the Catholic Church claims to possess exclusively. These ways of thinking will not do enough to take a deep look at reorganizing the structures of thought that enabled the wrongs to begin with. Church teaching does change, but recall that after centuries of anti-Jewish rhetoric, the tragedy of the Shoah only moved the Second Vatican Council toward graded inclusivism. Perhaps the tragedies of residential schooling and ongoing colonization will prompt enough persons in the church to call for further change. Perhaps these tragedies will awaken the church to recognize that its relations with non-Christian religions continue with this blind spot, and that in order to change the way it recognizes Indigenous spiritualities, it will need to fundamentally reconsider how it understands all non-Christian religions, all the way back to the portrayal of Jews and Judaism in its scriptures. I am very hesitant to speak about what this argument might mean to Indigenous persons. All I offer here is my hope that it will lend to a healthy skepticism when encountering and receiving Catholic Church efforts in the reconciliation process. This argument presents Catholics with an observation that their religion was and remains, in our day, structured on a view that it is superior to other religions. Its early and ongoing supersessionist assessment of Judaism is consistent with the colonial attitude and ongoing colonization. It presents the question of how much and how seriously Catholic persons and institutions like schools will take Nostra Aetate's teaching into their daily lives, encounters with non-Christians, and very importantly, their reconciliation work. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Thank you very much, Graham. So we have about 15 minutes for conversation. Who would like to ask the first question? There are also people on Zoom are also welcome to ask questions in the chat box, which Scott will receive, and then he'll flag me down, and we will be able to hear your voice, I think, through the speakers in the room. Jim.
Thanks, Graham. That's really very insightful. And one question that remains, though, is how it makes perfect sense how you laid it out, but it's difficult to see how any religion could regard itself as one religion among others without having some sort of superior claim on the truth. And I don't know how you would foresee a Catholic reaction or a Catholic response, let's say, to your argument that would say, how could they possibly say, we understand that we don't have an exclusive claim on the truth? That makes sense. What would a healthy or good or productive response?
Yeah, I thought a lot about, so the question was, and I hope I summarize it accurately for the Zoom listeners. Just isn't it normal that Catholicism or any religion might hold an exclusivist claim to truth? And so what might I think about that? That would take a lot more work. That's a really good question. It would take a lot more work. I don't know if I'm that kind of, scholar, theologian to be able to work that out, and maybe not here in the time that we have. I have thought about it, and what we see from just the experiences of exclusivism is that it's done some real damage to humanity. So for any believer to have an exclusivist belief and see this problem of damage to humanity, that's something that they have to contend with and grapple with, and so that's, I think, where I would leave the answer. It just doesn't look like it's working, and so that is, I'll speak for Catholic, from a Catholic perspective, Catholic insider perspective. That's something that needs to be worked on more. Sorry, I don't have a deeper answer than that.
Can I just use Jim's very good question, and encourage you, implore you to just to think about the possibility that, like, how could the church be any other way? I mean, and still be the church. This particular church. This is the imperial church par excellence. How is it going to be able to say, tell you what, we're going to actually bracket that whole special approach or special gifting of the truth. We're going to bracket that, and that's our way forward. I mean,
yeah,
that might be acceptable. It's hard to imagine the church doing that because it has this huge footprint historically, but also even today.
Yeah.
How would it do that? I mean, I guess I just want to encourage you to reflect on this. It seems to me that would be calling for the end of the church as you know it.
Yeah. Thanks for giving.
And maybe that's what you're asking for, and that's fine. But it feels like
no. Thanks for giving me an extra chance to offer some more on the topic Jim opened up here. Is that you're quite right, Paul. It's just been so entrenched for so many centuries, and the way of teaching and learning and liturgy just has reinforced that. It would call for I think a very serious look into the history of the church, and into the history of its scriptures, how the scriptures were composed and why, and to see them in context, and to see that there wasn't one single Christianity, even from the beginning. There were several Christianities, and the idea of unity, or the idea of, I'll take it up a notch, perfect unity, that developed over time. And that if one goes back and looks at that and sees that people actually had choices to go in the direction of unity, or that extra step to perfect unity, that can lend, I think, some real intellectual legs to an argument that This is just something that has been agreed on and then gained incredible momentum, and that there are other choices available.
Thank you. John, I knew you were going to ask a question. John and then Jared. Justin.
Really fantastic work. Not that
Twice.
I find it interesting that the two questions that have been asked are explicitly invitations to be a theologian. I wonder if this means that you did too good a job explaining what is theologically problematic in the document of Nostra Aetate Dignitatis Humane and how they appear in the school curriculum, thus setting up this natural next question. Okay, you've used theology to show what might be theologically wanting, so now be a theologian and fix it. This raises a question about this project and people. As a person who follows philosophies of education and so forth, so I can just ask you to sort of think of what your role is vis-a-vis this talk. Like, I mean, I don't think you did this talk in order to be a theologian, right? I mean, that's not your professional career. So it's interesting, like, what is it that you're trying to get accomplished as a person on the faculty of education? Such that you can say, you know, that's John's job, these questions are thought about. It's not mine, but my job is, what is that?
Okay, can I pick it up here?
Yeah.
I'll do the summary, and then if I miss something, correct me, and then I'll correct the summary. Okay, so John Tatamanel has asked if, since I did so much theological work, it's not surprising that, you know, the theological questions come up, but he's pointed out that, you know, I'm not a theologian. So he's wondering, like, what I'm up to and how I see myself within this project. That's fair? Okay, so thank you for opening that question. And I had not anticipated this, but
Really? What? Have you met him?
I,
What are you talking about?
but I think but I do have an answer, and I do think that as a scholar of education, it's my job to look at the institution of the Catholic school, as I've defined my scholarship. Okay, it's my job to look at that institution and to look at its relationship with the magisterial church, like the bishops and pope and cardinals, etc., and also to look at its relationship with the people it serves, and to look at ways in which the question of who is church, how is church, get lived out in those areas. I think attendance at Catholic schools is greater than attendance at Catholic liturgies. I think a lot of people who identify as Catholic, I think more people who identify as Catholic are going to Catholic schools than are going to Catholic liturgies. And the Catholic school, therefore, is a major institutional player in how they understand themselves, you know, as Catholics, however they understand themselves as Catholics, various degrees of participation and identification. So I've taken on my role then as looking at how the Catholic school is more than just an arm of the church's head, okay? And how it does more than just enact the orders in a command hierarchy, and how it actually, as a living iteration of the church, as the church, thinking of the church as people, before thinking of it as hierarchy. You can also find that if anyone likes to look in the Vatican II documents, but how that institution informs or could inform the church. So it's by looking at curricula here, I'm looking at how this works. How would Catholic students be taught to regard their Jewish neighbor or their indigenous neighbor and who sees themselves apart from Christianity? And in my view, this curricula is not doing it, but as well as it might. And so how can the school be thought as an authoritative place to begin or continue answering those questions, or to revise the current answers to those questions?
Justin, and then someone on Zoom.
Fascinating. In different ways, though, a couple of those excerpts from the school curriculum actually are outright anti-Semitic as far as I'm concerned. And I don't use the term anti-Semitic lightly, but it's appalled to see that. In terms of the questions being raised theologically, it seems to me that there's hope in all the Catholics that Pope John Paul was complaining about, right? All of those Catholics who think that one religion is as good as another, maybe are a source of wisdom on this, more so than the Vatican authorities. But what I wanted to ask is about the erasure of history in some of these statements. You know, to say in the Vatican documents or later statements that Catholic doctrine forbids coercion in religion. Hello, there would be a thriving Jewish community in Spain and Portugal to this day, for example, had not the church and secular, as it were, authorities in 1492 and 1497 decided that everybody had to convert to Catholicism, the true religion, or get out. Is the church blind to its own history, or lying about it, or what's going on?
Okay, so Justin Lewis has asked the question of, is the church blind to its own history, and has raised the example of the coercion. If the church is claiming non-coercion, well, he just points to the examples in Spain and Portugal with the ultimatum that was presented of, you know, either convert to Christianity or leave. And so, like, why isn't this being taught? I don't know, and I think I should know. So that's something I'll want to look up. But I can, like, on that particular question, as you present it, you know, I don't know why someone, you know, wouldn't include that in the curricula rather than other questions, that particular one. I do know that when I look at curricula, there is an approach taken where the primary focus is on teaching students about the church in the present day. If there is, as you say, that erasure of history, unfortunately, like, it's, I don't think religion curricula do a good enough job in Catholic schools of even exploring, like, Vatican II or the context that led up to it, and the say the difference between the Council of Trent and Vatican Council I, and then Vatican II. It's just not looking at those kinds of questions. So if I were to stop there, you could see, well, then it's very easy to see how something like that, you know, slipped away or got lost. I think some like history courses do talk about, you know, corruption in the papacy, for example, or they might talk about that, but it is actually seen as like history in the past, just, you know, something that has happened, but we don't do that anymore. And so what is done now, and how to be a believing Catholic, and then these, like, sort of contemporary moral questions and contemporary theological questions of and quite honestly, there's a concern that there are many unchurched Catholics, is the term that gets used. So, like I alluded to earlier, more students who identify as Catholic are showing up at school, but fewer at the parishes for like liturgy. And so the school is taking on this job of teaching students what they hope they would have learned in the home on how to be a Catholic person. That's the focus. And yeah, as you can see, because I haven't talked about Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula several centuries ago, yeah, it gets squeezed out, just as I kind of squeezed it out in my answer. Yeah. So,
Scott?
Is that me?
Go ahead, Andrew. Harris.
You're calling on me. So, as a working religious educator in the Anglican tradition, I want to thank you so much for your work here. And my question is about educational approach to teaching in the context of reconciliation. And reconciliation is in itself a dynamic idea that has to be grounded in action to have meaning. So my question is a didactic and discussion-based approach the best approach to reconciliation, or are there more dynamic approaches to teaching the concept of reconciliation available to educators? I'm thinking really, obviously, maybe of the arts, which has been a major theme in Catholicism in the past.
I'm pretty sure that's not Ansley Tucker.
Yeah, Kate Newman.
That sounds like Kate. Thanks, Kate. I don't know if you heard that well enough to articulate, because now I think the Zoom folks would have heard that, but now the room is a bit.
Should I say it again?
yeah, I got. I think I got most of the question. I think I got 90% of it, and so I think the question is, if there is like a discussion-based, sort of more cognitive focus on thinking, then what about action forms or actions that would contribute to reconciliation?
At the basis and approach
and then
to this
how might this
subject.
be thought of?
An educational approach to this topic.
Mention of art as one approach.
Yeah.
I think that question's kind of got me. I'm sorry. I haven't thought about particular ways of enacting, particular pedagogical like methods to follow up on this. I've been really talking about the aims of Catholic education in this area. When I set out to teach something, I do take a long time to actually sit with the aims and think about the kinds of experiences and activities. And I don't have that time right now, and I haven't taken the time yet. So I'm sorry, unless there's another way the question could come to me, I don't know if I have a good answer to it.
Maybe we can have Kate be the special guest at coffee tomorrow. Speaking of coffee tomorrow, we have to let people go home for dinner tonight. So could you please just push the forward button on the slides? One more. Thank you. Okay, good. So we have the Artist in Residence talk next week, same time, same place. So please join us for that. Straven is going to give their talk. So we're looking forward to seeing that. So please join me in thanking. Great, that was wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
All right, yeah, great. Thanks, Dave. And so those of you who are in the room are all, of course, warmly welcome to come tomorrow at 11, where we'll tease this out more, as we always do on Fridays. So thanks.